Hello, this is Writers at Work, a podcast for readers and writers about the joys, heartaches, challenges, and satisfaction of the creative writing process. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Friends, before we begin, I want to tell you about an experience I had this week leading up to this Writers at Work interview. For the first time, I watched a movie as I was reading the short stories upon which it was based. Not simultaneously, of course. I read the short stories in the evening, watched the film in the afternoon, read the short stories again, then watched the film one more time. The short stories, 2 in a collection of 12, and the film were written by the same author, Ben Shattuck, who is our guest today. The History of Sound is the name of the collection and the film, and they share more than a title. I found Ben's interpretation of his prose to be uncanny, not just on plot points, but on its ambiance, its pacing, its color, and so on. I was deeply engaged in both, not quite hypnotized, but residing deeply within the words and images. Ben Shattuck is a writer and painter from coastal Massachusetts, a graduate and former teaching writing fellow of the Iowa Writers Workshop. His writing has appeared in the Harvard Review, the New Republic, the Paris Review Daily, and other publications. His paintings have been exhibited in galleries in New York, Boston, and Williamstown, Massachusetts, and the New Bedford Art Museum. His debut short story, Edwin Chase of Nantucket, was selected to appear in the anthology PEN America Best Debut Short Stories 2017. It also appears in the History of Sound collection. Ben's first book, 6 Walks, was published by Tin House in 2022. That memoir tracks the author's retracing of 6 walks taken by Henry David Thoreau. His second book, The History of Sound Stories, was published by Viking in 2024. The film, The History of Sound, opens in the U.S. on September 12th. Ben Shattuck, welcome to Writers at Work.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Ben, in the introduction, I spoke of the consistency between the source material and the film. Can we discuss that?
Yeah.
Okay, so let's begin with at the very basic point. When you sold the rights to the short stories, The History of Sound, and Origin Stories, did your reps insist that you be the screenwriter?
Well, I actually sold the rights to The History of Sound before the book, and that was also before writing origin stories. I had it has a The History of Sound, the project is I guess it would be like 4 moons orbiting a planet of a theme. There's the movie, there's the screenplay, there's the book itself, and then there's the short story. And the first thing that came was the short story. And I wrote that while I was a student at the Iowa Writers Workshop back in, my gosh, this is this really shows how long it takes to get a story into shape. I think I wrote it in 2010. 15 years ago, I first wrote that story. Yeah, it was different. It was totally different, and it needed, the basics were there. It was about 2 folk song collectors. Their relationship wasn't in there, but the wax cylinders and the basic shape of the plot was there. And then I put the story down for years and years while I wrote another book. I, was fully involved in my painting career. I just did other things. And then when the short story, it was published 2016, I want to say, is that right? Yeah, so it finally was published 6 years after I first wrote it. And then this isn't well, it was in the Pushcart anthology, and
Right.
got a little more recognition and a larger readership because of that. And a producer in Los Angeles who was actually from Concord, Mass, who had a New England sensibility, read it and liked it and asked if I wanted to set up a meeting. And no, I had no film agents at all. No agents at all. I mean, I had a book agent, but I've like fallen sideways into a screenwriting career. It was just my own sort of insistence when they bought the rights that I would write the screenplay. And that was because of nothing but being naive and thinking that I could probably write the best version, whatever the medium was, whether it was film or a short story or a novel or whatever it was, whatever the central nugget of this narrative was. I felt that I would be able, that I understood it best. If I go now, what I know about the film industry, that was kind of a crazy move. It would have been, it would have given the film a better chance of being made if I had said, sure, and go find the best screenwriter in Hollywood to turn this into a film. Instead, I said, me, Ben Shattuck, who's never written a screenplay ever in his life, should try to write this story. And it worked out.
When did and let me just tell our listeners that the film um, is the first short story in the collection and the last short story in the collection, and it rounds off beautifully. You thrust us forward, what, 40 years, 30 years, or something like that.
Yeah, about that. It got changed a few times.
Yeah, and it really does round off the story so beautifully. So, and the last story is called Origin Stories. Did you wrote that after you began the screenplay?
Yeah. And in a way, I mean, it's so funny that you say it's both the first and the last story. It actually, I mean, you're right. There are parts of the last story, but mostly the entire screenplay was written from the short story. And then if I were to order them chronologically, it would be, I wrote The History of Sound, the short story, then the screenplay, then origin stories. And I think if I
Right.
had written origin stories before, I would have tried to include more of it into the history of sound. And why I think it was an advantage that the those three pieces were written in that order, because it allowed for the history of sound, the screenplay, which is, I'll say a different version from the movie, because anybody who knows how screenplays are translated into film, a lot is changed and cut and moved around. And, directors are writers, artists, editors, all in one. So the screenplay is like a suggestion. I've been calling it like architectural plans for hallucination. And you hope that the actors, the director, the DP, the producers all participate in the same hallucination, but there's absolutely no guarantee. So they are all separate elements. And but the screenplay, but to go back, the screenplay, by writing it before origin stories, I think I allowed the central narrative between Lionel and David to take center stage and not be distracted by the flash forward.
Right. Now, to my mind, the short stories, all of them in the history of sound, um, th- they're quiet stories. They're evenly paced. They unfold in their own time. They're tactile. There's room for the reader to look around, and I felt that the film had captured that beautifully. Um, we all have seen films that don't quite correspond to source material. But somehow you and Oliver Hermanus preserved what I found special about your short fiction. And so my question is, how did you do that?
Well, that's such a nice way to phrase it. I like what you said about the reader looking around. You're right. I mean, as you develop as a writer, I think when I was in college, I thought being a great writer meant choosing the right adjective and putting together a snappy sentence and describing the way, a light rakes through a tree in a novel and fascinating uh, arrangement of language. And then over the years, and as you develop as a writer, at least as I have developed as a writer and crossing the thresholds into my 40s, other elements of narrative and character start to reveal themselves as being the most important. And one of those is pacing. It's really hard to pace something in a way that matches and leads and anticipates a reader's emotions, you have to, it's like turning a dial. You have to do it just right. And the surprises need to come at just the right time. If I were to uh, draw the plot arc of the history of sound, it would look really weird, as the short story. It's not like Freytag's pyramid. It doesn't have a standard, um, exposition, rising action, climax, denouement, and ending in like the camel hump. It has it goes along for a while. You're not quite sure what it is. The narrator even calls out that pacing and says, in one line I have, my grandfather says happiness isn't a story, so there's not much to say about those few weeks. um, and then it's almost asymptotic, and then it just rockets at the end, and you understand what this whole story has been about. And so that shape, that bizarre shape of the short story, which resists a standard um, a standard format, was a challenge to put together, to translate into film. And I think from the very beginning, what Oliver had said is, one, this was not going to be a romance between two people. This was going to be about Lionel Worthing, Paul Mescal's character's life. And so we had to focus on on that one character, on that central protagonist, because the story, the emotional fulcrum, is how he doesn't realize he should be regretting something that he actually regrets. It's like a strange logical fold. And so we needed to put in scenes, expand his time in Rome, expand his time in England, expand his actual life, to pace it out so that when he finally experiences that gutting truth, that his greatest love, that the truest feeling he had in a relationship was only a few months in his early 20s, that would feel as powerful and shattering to the reader or the viewer as it would to Lionel's character.
Oh. Getting back to the stories for a minute. Um, if our goal as a novelist or short story writer is to retain the reader's attention throughout, and not give them an opportunity to leave, one way we do that is through pacing. Um, and when you take the kind of pacing that you do in your stories, Ben, I find it's very dangerous, because it's so quiet, and the reader is not going to stick around waiting for the explosion or some act of horror or something melodramatic. Um, your stories. Um, if I were to plot them out, I would almost make them a straight line. Um, and uh, and I I don't know really how you did it, and that's one of my experiences as a writer that I love as a reader. I love the experience of not knowing how the author did it. And So therefore, when I saw it on screen, I thought, "Oh my gosh, there it is!" I'm riveted, and really nothing fantastic has happened, but something really deep is happening all the time. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. And I think, I mean, we all have favorite paragraphs or sentences or stories or passages in novels of our own writing that maybe might get overlooked. And one of my favorite stories of the collection, or the one that really means a lot to me, and I can't quite say why, is the second story in the collection, Edwin Chase of Nantucket.
Yeah.
And essentially nothing happens there. There's almost no present action at all. It's a man comes to this secluded house where a mother and her grown son are living. It's the mother's teenage lover, who she maybe never got over, or was, it's not, it's not explained why she was taken to Nantucket from Cape Cod, and that's intentional, to leave that big gap for the for the reader, because the son also doesn't know, and I was trying to filter the information through the protagonist. Um, and the biggest action in that, like, if there was such thing as a climax in that book, it would be placed actually in that story, sorry, it would be placed at the end, where he just writes a couple words on the back of a painting, and that, to fake an appreciation or an attention towards his mother from the man who came, who sort of discarded his mother. And it an action like that feels really loud only because the story is so quiet. And my sensibilities as a writer, and actually in my life, um, growing up as I did in a rural setting in Massachusetts, the most exciting parts of my life seem to be those quieter moments, and that are really linked, and it's no surprise that a book about Henry David Thoreau and the Transcendentalist was my first book, were really linked to moments in nature that were quiet or quietly interrupted, by acts of nature, snow falling in a marsh in November, or a murmuration of starlings moving over a field. These always felt like big events to me, and I think it's no surprise that they show up as big events in my fiction.
No, I think your stories, Ben, and also the film, um, require some thought afterwards.
Hmm.
And I love that also. I mean, that's the ripple effect. That's how art takes residence within us. Um, what I found really interesting is the way Lionel becomes increasingly definitive when he makes a decision.
Mm.
Um, because I think you alluded to earlier that um, he probably made the wrong decision when he was young. But when he says to his mother or to a friend or to a fiance, a girlfriend, I'm leaving, that's it. He's gone. There's no, and I thought Paul Mescal was beautiful in conveying that stillness. I've made my decision and I'm going.
Yeah, and what's astounding to see in the film version and how Paul acts it is he really um, solidifies what you just mentioned, is that when he's the only time, I mean, he makes he's like a hard, sharp obsidian almost, like he cuts into the world sometimes, and he says, I'm leaving. But the only time that he's receptive and soft and caught on his back foot, and um almost shy or pulled back, like a retracted version, is when he's around David or hearing information about David.
Right.
His polarity changes. I mean, one of the most astounding acting moments, I think, in the film is when um, Paul's character Lionel discovers from the music lecturer that David has died, and it's just, on the screenplay, it's four letters. It's just what. It's the word what, and the way Paul delivers that what is so powerful. And he really, his head sort of goes back and his face slackens, and it's so much emotion of being like a receptacle for pain, and it's so different from the breakup in England, which he seems a little, not sociopathic, but he doesn't he discards the feelings of the person that he's breaking up with.
Right. My reaction to that scene where he finds out about David, there's such a stillness in it, and and we see it from a distance. It takes place in a lecture hall, and we're at the back of the hall at a certain point.
Yeah,
And I think we're thinking, please say something to both men, because that moment, once there's been that revelation, there's really nothing for them to say to each other.
yeah,
Um, because because Lionel doesn't say, "Tell me more about David" or "Tell me what happened," or it's just the information is conveyed. It lands heavily on Lionel, and that's it.
Yeah, and that is and that is the the center point of the story is, and the entire collection is about, if there was a theme, it's the things left unsaid, the misunderstandings, the dark matter, sorry, of our lives, the things that could have happened but didn't because you didn't take that step in the right direction and echo through time. And some people might call it what, generational trauma. Some people might call it family secrets. Some people, there's all sorts of ways to diagnose what it is, but it is a real force, and that's like it's in the title. If the history of sound, the title had a meaning, the meaning is that the whole sentence fragment is in the story. It's the history of sound lost daily, period. And
Yeah.
it's about all those things that weren't captured, the history of sounds that weren't captured, and not in this story, but in somebody's life. You might have missed the last time your father spoke before he passed away, the first time your spouse said I love you, the sound of your child's voice when they were a baby, the sitting on your porch as a child listening to peepers in the springtime, whatever it is that is out there that's just gone because you weren't able to capture it. That's the large, like, underlined emotional description of this story itself, is that Lionel didn't say the thing, didn't stay on the train platform, what held back for a little bit, and that instinct to hold back haunts him forever.
So the director, Oliver Hermanus, is from South Africa, and I think of your story as quintessentially American. Um, did he see things in your screenplay worthy of emphasis that you may have underplayed because he was coming at it as kind of an outsider?
Um, well, sorry, can you rephrase that maybe he disagreed with, or that he
No,
wanted
not
to be over?
necessarily disagreed. He might you might have um, conveyed something. You may have underplayed something because you are so familiar with the American landscape. And he may, as coming at it from an outsider, may have thought we need to emphasize this a little bit more, or isn't this interesting? I was unaware of this, or something that gave him a different form of interpretation.
Right. I mean, something that, if we're talking about landscape specifically, I remember, when I see well, I was listening to an interview. Let me back up. I was listening to an interview with, I want to say, J. Courtney Sullivan, who wrote The Cliffs. And the interviewer was asking, why are there so many books written about Maine? And he was saying, there's this, there's that. And she was just letting him go on and on. And then she just said back to him, have you ever been to Maine? Like, it's just obviously one of the most powerfully spiritual, or there's just something radiating from the landscape of coastal Maine. All the painters go there. There's a reason. I don't know what it is. It's the ley lines and the magnetic pulse or whatever it is, but you go there and it feels like it's filled with stories, and the landscape is really alive. And when I see the movie, which is very much not filmed in Maine. It's filmed in New Jersey because of
Mhm.
the reason that every film is located, tax reasons, and where how a cast and crew and the hundreds of people it take to make a film, where they can stay, where they can eat,
Right.
where they can, like, how do you make this thing? Um, and so for Oliver, I mean, that's a funny thing. I think conversely, it's hard for me to see that landscape and pretend that it's Maine. But I Oliver didn't see that, and I think if he was an American director, he would have. I don't know what he would have done. Maybe not, but it just didn't. It's something I've never been asked this. And it's interesting you say that. But there was a point where I realized, oh, I'm seeing something, and I didn't emphasize it. But and so he didn't notice that like this type of landscape is so essential to the story itself, and it is underplayed in the story because of that J. Courtney Sullivan quote, which is like, you just know how powerful that landscape is, and you don't have to wax poetic about it. Now,
Right.
conversely, I'm not sure. I don't know if he brought anything out that there's so many parts of this story that, in this, as I say, this the story is one thing, the book is one thing, the movie's one thing, and the screenplay is a separate thing. There's a lot that made it into the film, a lot that didn't make it into the film, a lot that was Oliver's brilliant inventions. But there are moments that he really got of importance. Like there's a scene where Lionel's father shows him how to empty a tea bag and light the top on fire, and it drifts up into the sky, which for me as a writer was a perfect metaphor for what was going on between Lionel and David. And
Yes.
Lionel then teaches that to a few kids on the song collecting journey, and Oliver immediately understood how important it was to have a small scene like that, um, which might be quickly cut with another director.
Right. Right. I have to tell you, I grew up fairly close to where the film was shot, and I watched the credits to the end for a variety of reasons. But when I saw that it was filmed in Passaic, New Jersey, I couldn't believe it. I was watching the credits to see where in Kentucky it was filmed.
Oh, right. Yeah.
It, uh, and particularly in the beginning, it's not quite black and white, but there's such a grayness.
Yeah.
It's so gray, which is perfect. And yeah, I mean, the magic of film, right? Passaic, New
Magic of
Jersey.
film. Magic of film, or the magic of the suspension of disbelief. Or,
Yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah.
like, I, this
Well,
is
I mean, there's no diners in.
that's true. I mean, this is slightly off topic, but I just what I was thinking about this when there's been all these discussions about AI and readership, and if people are still going to be reading books and whatever, the streamers, that whole large conversation that we can put in one bucket. And I was thinking about that in midsummer when it was the 50th anniversary of Jaws. And there were all these podcasts and people on the radio talking about how unbelievably unlikely it is to be killed by a shark. I think the fact is that you have more chance of dying from stepping in a hole on the beach that a child has dug than actually being killed by a shark on that same beach. And that 7 people a year are killed by sharks, and way more by any other animal attack, tens of thousands by snakes or whatever it is. But still everybody's afraid of sharks. And I was thinking about that fact, I was like, that is why books are never going to die, because the power of the human imagination, whenever anybody gets into the water, they see into that deep dark space and they can just feel danger looming. And that is like a wild, feral, vivid example of how powerful the human imagination is.
Yeah.
And I just like, oh, people are never going to stop reading. As long as they're afraid of sharks, they're never going to stop reading.
Well, I don't know. To me, it's analogous to drum machines. I mean, when drum machines first came around, they were clearly a drum machine. They were not drummers.
Yeah.
Everybody now, drum machines can be programmed to swing. They sound a lot like drummers, but there's just something about a real drummer that cannot be replaced.
Yeah.
And you know it at an intuitive level. And I don't, but like, for example, one of my favorite authors is Penelope Fitzgerald. And I can't imagine a machine replicating her entire oeuvre. I don't know how a machine could anticipate what she was going to do next.
Right. I mean, that's the hilarious. I mean, that's just like when anybody talks about like how AI works, and it's like they're anticipating the next word based on all the others. It's like, wait a second, doesn't everybody realize that the greatest part of fiction writing is that it's unpredictable? Like,
Right.
if you asked Marilyn Robinson to predict the next, paragraph, she'd look at you and laugh. I mean, it's like the whole point is to push into unknown territory. And that's not just like a pretentious whatever, like workshopy lesson. It's actually what makes writing fun and exciting to both create and to consume. It seems obvious to me that it's the like the weirdness in writing and the mistakes in writing and the unpredictability that makes it exciting. And I think this is like exactly what the visual arts movements, especially in the pre Picasso, might have been working with. If whether it's like the Impressionists or the really loose Russian painters or even like the Boston Singer Sargent paintings, that's sort of like loose brushwork. It's in the mistakes that the
Right.
excitement exists. And probably with as you said, like the with a live drummer, it's that you pick up on the tiny little, like maybe there's a moment when it didn't hit quite right or whatever
Right.
makes it alive, exciting, and organic, which is the antithesis of whatever this AI, cliche writing will become.
Yeah, I think we just want the human connection. That's ultimately that's what we want.
Yeah.
Who knows? Maybe there'll be a generation that doesn't need that, but I certainly do. I don't mind when the drummer's sticks click or when he
Yeah.
hits the rim. I don't care. Anyway,
Yeah.
um, so music does play such an we're talking about drummers. Music does play such an important role in the film, um, and in the early part of the 20th century, I think you hinted at this earlier. The two protagonists are musicians who travel to capture on wax cylinders regional folk music. Okay, so bear with me for a moment here. As novelists and short story writers, we don't have music in our toolbox. We can refer to a type of music. We can describe the effect of music. Um, my question, were you hearing the music when you wrote the short story?
That's a good question. Yes, I mean the music in a way came before the short story. I grew up contra dancing. I play banjo and guitar. I love old time music and American folk music. When I was much younger, we when I grew up, we had one. No, we had like three TV stations, and of course, I was born in the '80s, so there's no other. There just wasn't a lot of distraction, and there was a lot of and every summer there would be a contra dance in my neighborhood. And when I first heard fiddles, it just sounded like the best music I had ever heard. And I loved it. It just, like, this happens with everybody has a story like this about a certain genre of music or a certain song where it just like it really hits a chord, as you might say. And so that music led me to the story. So as I was as I was writing the short story, I was thinking a little bit about the sound. I mean, I was also tracking all the dozens of pieces that you have to track as you put a story together, character development and verb choice and structure and how the plot's going to move forward and what are the emotions and all of that stuff. But it especially became true as I was writing the screenplay, because we had to actually start to choose songs. And I knew certain songs had a certain register or like a feeling that would be right for the scenes. And I put together a big
Playlist?
Spotify playlist,
Yeah,
Studio Sound
yeah,
samples.
yeah.
And then one of the most wonderful things that happened to the film was the great folk musician Sam Amadon, who now lives in London, who comes from a long tradition of American folk music, signed onto the project. And he actually trained Paul Mescal in that type of singing, which is a very specific type, not that 19th century folk ballad singing is a really specific sound. It's not, it's like the opposite of Broadway musicals.
Right.
So yeah, it was very much a part of that. And also it was a task to get everybody on the film project to um tune their ear to what that sound is, that it's not bluegrass. It's not country. It's old American old time music.
Yeah, and I think you in fact you just alluded to it. The songs aren't narrating the action. It's the feeling and the mood that they're conveying. I mean, it would have been just terrible if the songs were commenting on what was happening.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, there is one in there, the Unquiet Grave, and that came later. I think we took the Gene Ritchie version. That came later in the film because we couldn't quite decide on, and that one, if you just read a printout of the lyrics, has some striking similarities to what is going on in the story. The ballad tells the story of somebody being haunted by
Right,
somebody
right,
somebody who's died, and that
right.
in a way is a distillation of what's going on in the movie.
So that would have landed really subconsciously. That's wonderful.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
that's great. Um, I guess I should mention Oliver Coates, who did the score. It's
Yeah.
just so delicate, and it's just right. I mean, it's so non-intrusive, and um,
Yeah, I mean, Oliver Herman, as I've said uh, before, to add to the list of my inexperience with films, when I first got on this project, I was like, oh yeah, directors. They're just glorified events organizers who put this person together, that person together, and find the financing, and here we go. But Oliver Herman it's as any director, as anybody will know who's involved in movies, they're really artists, and they're really using the actors, the script, the music, the production design. They're all just colors that they're mixing together and making their own work of art. And it's like Oliver just had great taste and knows that Ollie Coates would be the perfect addition to the film.
yeah, wonderful.
Yeah.
So you have this collection of wonderful short stories. You have a memoir of Six Walks. Are you opposed to writing a novel?
Uh, no, the novel might be opposed to letting me write it. I am trying. Yeah, no, I have. This is part of a two-book deal for Viking, so I am working on a novel right now.
Yeah. So I looked at your background and I looked at where you were raised, and I had an odd thought. I had the thought that you are the writer you were destined to become.
Tell me more.
No, as it would have been if you tried to write Rocky 16 or like Stephen King. I don't know that it could have happened. I think what you're writing again, I'm reading so much into this work. It just seems to me what you're writing can't be faked.
Yeah, I think you're right. I mean, it's funny if you take a creative path in life, you start to realize that you really can't force um, much, and it starts to feel like my creative life from my mid 20s until now has really felt more like moving through a river and being caught in one tide and then or sorry, one current that flows into another tributary and then it flows into another. I mean, all through my 20s, I wasn't writing. I was painting. I went to Cornell Fine Art, the School of Fine Arts, and I was painting, and I had an interest in birds. And then I was working at research stations as a field assistant. And it was while I was at one of the field research stations. And I also, I was playing banjo at the same time. And I'd grown up in this place where I spent hours after school walking through the fields and making those really deep connections to the what would later become a transcendentalist connection.
Mm.
Um, and I was just building up life experience and sensibility. And it was while I was at one of these research stations I started writing short stories. But that wasn't until, let me think, I was in my late 20s, and I used those short stories to apply to graduate school. And by the time I got there, I had all of the, it just felt almost accidental. Like I just one step in front of the other. And that this is so strange to say, but it took there is something really helpful about ambition, and then there's something really destructive about ambition, and there's something really helpful in the creative path to be open to the opportunities that come and to just use the resources that I have, which is life experience and sensibilities of, ornithology and visual arts. All those, I mean, all my backgrounds are basically tossed into the short stories. There's a researcher, there's a painter, there's all, and just put them into the stories and not try to force it out. And then what eventually happens is that sort of, that frictionless, smooth quality of feeling like you're in, at least when I'm trying to write a good short story, that you're in on a in stable in the hands of a writer or a person who's trying to imagine a world that comes from a place of truth and not just pure, ambitious invention.
Right. And that ambition can uh, materialize as quietness. It doesn't have
Yeah.
to be boastful and loud and attention drawing. It can simply be, as you say, an amalgamation of all available tools to express a singular vision.
Right. Yeah. I mean, this isn't a secret because it just, it's out there on the news now. But my next project after the history of sound for screenplays was I wrote an adaptation of a World War One story for the director and actor Ben Stiller. And when he approached me, I said, have you read my other work? I'm going to probably write the quietest World War II story you have ever read adaptation. And I think it worked out really well. But that's because I just can't. It's too hard to be the writer that I'm not. I just
Right.
it makes sense on an aesthetic level, an efficiency level, and just like a truth level that I can only write as like the whatever the nature loving kid from Massachusetts.
My guest on this episode of Writers at Work is Ben Shattuck, whose meticulous and deeply satisfying short stories are the source of the new film, The History of Sound, which Ben also wrote. Ben, thanks so much for joining us on Writers at Work.
Thank you. It was a joy to be here.
Writers at Work is a production of Bliss Publications. Erin Mitchell is our producer. Music is by Joni Mitchell, performed by Keith Jarrett. For more, see writersatworkpodcast.com. I'm your host, Jim Fusilli. Until next time, happy reading.